I'm going to do a quick tutorial on tent painting, or at least how I have painted mine so far, because I think it's a great project for the pandemic. It is cheap and time consuming. So here we go. So first you want to find an inspiration image. I looked at 14th and 15th century tents when I was originally doing this. I started this whole process about 5 years ago when I made the tent, and then immediately started painting the tent because I was afraid that if I didn't start immediately, I would never get around to it. And in fact, I painted it halfway and then never got around to finishing it. So I'm trying to finish it now. So anyway, back then I looked at images from the 14th and 15th century and really liked this one. My tent is a round, but I was really drawn to this sort of design, which is very popular in the imagery of the time, this sort of style. And I took some other inspiration from like the roof of this one. I looked at these sorts of things. I looked at a bunch of others. These are all from the 15th century, though there were some other 14th century versions as well. But I liked the blue, and that seemed to be a really common. I liked these strong seam lines and all the little arches in them like this. So anyway, after looking at a bunch, I drew up a plan to scale, and this is my drawing from a million years ago. And when I restarted this process, I did go back and look at images again, and then decided that I really did like my original plan. And since I still like it after 5 years, there's a solid hope that I will continue to like it. So I decided to go ahead with the original plan. And to start with, so if you can see here, the dark lines are what I already had, but I followed the same process for the original design as well. And I realized that painting tape was the same, roughly the same color as what I wanted and about the same width. So I put painter's tape on the tent to just sort of get an idea of how the proportions would look. And once I'd fiddled with that a little bit, I started drawing up paper templates. So once I had sort of a plan, I could start painting. So these are what I used. I did transfer the templates to cardstock templates, if you can see down here, and neatened them up a little bit. But I used outdoor latex house paint, watered down a little bit. You can use other things. For this project, I wasn't particularly concerned about historical accuracy of the materials, since the tent itself is not historically accurate in materials. I was going for the look and the ability to have it hold up for many more years. So I had decided years ago to go with latex house paint. I'd read a bunch of things online and a bunch of people had used it. And it's held up really well for the last 5 years. It hasn't really faded. I haven't had any weird leaking issues. And so I put some in this kimchi container. You can use any container, but I like this one because it's sort of stable and low to the ground, because you don't want to spill on the tent, and you are going to be moving the paint across the tent as you work on it. I wanted a container that wasn't going to be very tippy. So I started with about half and half, which was half paint, half water. That was too runny. You want it to sink into the fabric a little bit, but you don't want it to sink in too much or spread. But you do want to water it down some, so because the unwatered paint just sort of sits on the top of the tent. So I added paint back to it. I think I ended up with about 3-to-1 or 2-to-1 paint to water. 3 parts paint, 1 part water, 2 parts paint, 1 part water. And that seemed about right. You can sort of play with your mix a little bit, especially if you have some test fabric to see how it paints up. So other than that, I used a ruler for helping to lay out the designs. I used some string to make the circles at the top of the roof by using it as like a compass. a paintbrush. Mine's a little bit narrower than the lines that I use, so I can kind of go in with, try and get one side straight and then come back and do the other side straight. But not so small that it takes a million years. And then I talked about my templates, and then chalk. Originally I had used pencil, but it turned out that I couldn't erase the pencil. So it was sort of a permanent marking. And after 5 years, I still have some of my original pencil lines. So they don't really fade either. They're not really noticeable when the tent's in use, but I decided to go with chalk this time in the hopes that it would be slightly less permanent. And then I used blue chalk just in case it didn't completely wash out. You can also use a chalk line if you want to get long straight lines. If you could lay out your tent straight enough that your tent isn't wobbly on the straight line. So onto the laying out the pattern. I just measured up from the seam line because I'm working in a small space. I can't get my tent stretched out completely. The fabric's a little bit wobbly, so I just measured from the seam line here. So even though the seam is wobbly, I can kind of get a straight line. I kind of pull the tent, mark the line, and then move on. And then even when it wrinkles up when I'm painting, I still get a semi-straight line. And then here you can see how I'm using the template. So once I've measured out the main straight lines, I did use a template to make these arches initially as well. I measured down from this point, measured down to the tip of the template, and then to make sure that the points are still in line, I measure from the tip down to here. So I sort of had this triangle of alignment, and it's not perfect. Each panel is a little bit off from the others, but hopefully it won't be too noticeable in the full thing. And when you do look at handcrafted things from the period, they do have some slight variances. So hopefully it'll be fine. So beginning to paint, I just painted in the lines. Slowly, you want to make sure that you're not dropping paint on the tent because you can't go back. That's the hardest part of this, is just making sure that you don't mess up. If you do, you can paint over it with a color that matches your tent canvas, but it is going to be noticeable from the inside because you're going to have a black or a mark where the sun doesn't shine through like the other canvas. But as the tent gets wear, you're also going to get marks on it. So as long as you don't make a big mistake, it should be completely unnoticeable. And as you can see, even though it looks pretty straight up here, the lines are kind of wobbly. And what happens too is if I end up going out of the line a little bit, I just try and smooth that out so I don't have any sharp like divots. And if you can make them as straight as possible, but again, like if there's some wobble to it, it's not so noticeable when you set the tent up. And in fact, going over this, I've used the tent for years. It feels fairly straight when I'm in the tent. It doesn't look too weird, but then when I was going back and repainting over the lines that I initially did to get the blues to match, they're really wobbly. So don't worry too much because you're looking at it so close. You're never going to look at it as close as you are when you're actively painting it. And then here I did the same with the eaves, the quatrefoils here. I do paint in stages because you don't want to sit in your painted spot, so you kind of want to plan. Start painting in one spot so you can work your way around and not be working through wet paint. You also don't want to work too long because as you get tired, you start making mistakes. So I choose a section, I finish that up, I let it dry, and then I come back and I do the next sections. And then here, I don't have a picture of the completed project because it's still in progress. But even here, you can see what a difference that painting makes. So this was my tent initially. And then even with those main seam lines painted, it makes a big difference in the look and the feel of the tent. And yeah, I hope it's not a very hard project to do. It just is meticulous and takes time, which is perfect for now when we have a bunch of sunny days, we can't go anywhere, so why not paint? So yeah, if you get your tent painted up, I'd love to see pictures. And if you have any questions, let me know.